Here is how it ended. Thomas Wren set a manila folder on the conference table at 9:42 on a Monday morning, and Bernard Pruitt, who had run Meridian General Hospital for 22 years, who had shaken governors' hands and appeared on the cover of 3 regional healthcare magazines, and who had, by my reckoning, destroyed the careers of at least 5 physicians and directly contributed to the death of 1 patient, looked at that folder with the expression of a man who has understood, finally, the precise dimensions of the trap he is standing in. I want you to remember that face. I want you to hold it in your mind while I explain how we got to that room, because the face only means what it means when you know everything that preceded it. And the story doesn't have a beginning so much as it has a set of pieces that each looked individually like something explainable. A billing discrepancy, an unanswered email, a friend who offered help at a specific moment, a patient file from 12 years ago that had been reclassified 3 times. Each piece had an explanation. The explanation kept changing. That's the nature of this particular kind of wrong. It doesn't announce itself. It presents itself in ordinary administrative language, in reasonable excuses, in the patient accumulation of small, unremarkable moments that only reveal their meaning when you've assembled enough of them to see the shape. I assembled enough. My name is Nora Calloway. I am 42 years old, a trauma surgeon, and I have been doing this long enough to know that the human body keeps secrets even from itself, that there are fractures that don't show up on the first X-ray, bleeds that don't present symptoms for hours, damage running deep and quiet under a surface that reads as intact. I know this about bodies. It took me longer than it should have to understand that institutions work exactly the same way. But I should start with the rain. None of the rest of this makes sense without the rain. And the rain doesn't make sense without Eleanor Webb. And Eleanor Webb doesn't make sense until you understand who was in that waiting room the night she died, and what they chose to do, and what they chose not to do, and who made sure the choosing stayed quiet. I'll get to all of it, in the right order, which is not the order it happened. The rain came on a Tuesday in October, and I had been on my feet for 18 hours. This is not unusual. I am a trauma surgeon at a regional hospital that serves 4 counties, and the math of emergency medicine doesn't account for surgeon fatigue or the 3 cups of coffee I'd been running on since noon. What I remember about those last cases is what surgeons always remember, the procedural clarity. Everything else was noise. The body on the table was the signal, and for the duration of the procedure, there was nothing else in the world. That's why surgeons are surgeons. The operating room is the only room where everything genuinely, properly makes sense. The parking structure at midnight does not have this quality. I sat in my Subaru for 40 seconds with my hands on the wheel and nothing particular in my mind. The rain hammered the concrete, and the lights of the hospital were the usual amber gray, the color of bad news in adequate lighting. Then I drove out onto the county road and headed home. The road runs straight for a mile before it curves at the creek, and I have taken it so many times that my hands know it before my mind does. The headlights caught him before I consciously registered what I was seeing. A figure on the far shoulder past the guardrail, one arm braced on the metal, the other folded against his ribs in the specific way of someone managing something structural. My foot was on the brake before the thought formed. He was tall, over 6 feet, and soaked completely through, silver-haired, somewhere in his late 50s, and his face had been introduced recently to something hard. a laceration above the left eyebrow, bleeding in a thin, controlled line down his cheek, bruising along the jaw. The careful, contained stillness of someone in significant pain who has decided not to show it. His clothes had been expensive before whoever had done this finished with them. That was the first piece I collected that night, though I didn't know yet that I was collecting pieces. I filed it without filing it. Not a transient. Someone who had been somewhere specific. Someone who hadn't arrived there cleanly. Over the rain, giving him only what was immediately useful. "I'm a doctor. Can you walk to my car?" He looked at me with very pale blue eyes that paid the specific close attention of someone whose profession requires noticing things precisely and quickly. Slowly, like each word had a weight he was choosing carefully. "I can walk." He walked to the car without taking my arm when I offered it. He got in. The rain kept coming, and I drove because the most operationally efficient thing I could do was get him somewhere dry with adequate light and close a laceration that had been open long enough. On the drive, just taking inventory. "I'm going to ask you questions. Some of them are medical. You can answer the others or not." Steadily. "All right." I ran through the neurological basics, tracking, orientation, the absence of indicators that pointed me toward anything internal. His ribs were cracked on the left side, at least one, possibly two. The cut above his eye needed sutures. Nothing that required an emergency room if he didn't want one, and he was very clear on the subject of emergency rooms. Flatly, non-negotiable. No hospital. Without argument, because arguing takes time and this wasn't my emergency. "My house is 11 minutes. He said nothing. I drove. My house on Aldrich Street is a 1940s bungalow that I have been in the middle of renovating for 8 years. The kitchen has good light and a serious first aid kit in the hall closet. On the mantelpiece in the living room, there is a brass compass in a worn leather case, my mother's, given to me the morning I graduated from medical school, in a parking lot, in May light, while I was still processing that I had crossed over into something permanent. Pressing it into both my hands, looking at me directly. "The compass doesn't care about the chaos," she'd said. "It just points. Remember that. Even in surgery, especially in surgery." My mother was a surgeon for 32 years. She died 3 years ago. I have walked past that compass so many times over the last decade that I barely see it anymore. When you live with something long enough, it recedes into the background of the ordinary. Things you should pay attention to do this all the time. It is one of the most dangerous qualities of the familiar. The stranger sat at my kitchen table with the stillness of someone practicing patience, not enduring it, and I worked under the overhead light with the same focus I bring to any procedure. Cleaned the laceration, placed 4 sutures, 5-0 nylon, properly spaced, with the particular knot pattern I've used since residency that my colleague Dr. Marchetti used to tease me about because it was slightly more precise than the situation required. It is the knot I always tie. I didn't think about it. At some point, the stranger's gaze moved to the living room, to the compass on the mantelpiece. Quietly, not quite a question. "Your mother was a doctor." I was tying the 3rd suture. I didn't look up. "Surgeon, 32 years. She gave me that the day I graduated." A pause. He looked at it for a moment that felt slightly longer than looking at someone's mantelpiece usually takes, with the weight of something that's been true for a long time. I know what it costs. Knowing which direction is right. Tying off the last suture, cutting the thread. usually worth it. He said nothing to that. I made tea. He drank it. I showed him the guest room. I went to bed and slept the way I always sleep after a long shift, completely, immediately, like a power cut. In the morning, the guest room was empty. The mug was washed and on the rack. On the back of a grocery receipt, "Thank you. Meridian General is fortunate to have you. T.W." I read it twice. Thought briefly that T.W. was either the most laconic person I had ever treated or the most private. Folded the receipt into my jacket pocket. Drove to work. I was 40 minutes into morning rounds when I saw him. He was standing at the end of the 4th floor corridor near the windows, in a quiet navy suit with no tie and a federal ID badge clipped to his pocket, with the scar along his jaw looking clean in the morning light, and the 4 sutures sitting exactly where I'd placed them. He looked, in this context, exactly like what he apparently was, a man in his late 50s who had spent a career in rooms where consequential decisions were made and had developed the posture of someone permanently accustomed to that weight. Without preamble, holding out a folder. Thomas Wren, Office of Inspector General at HHS. I'm sorry for the unconventional introduction. I needed to not be in this building when it happened. He said it the way you hand someone a difficult diagnosis, with precision, without softening it. I opened the folder. My name was on the first page. This is the moment the puzzle began. Not the rain, not the receipt, not the man in the corridor. This. My name, in 14-point font, above a table of procedure codes and dates and billing amounts that didn't look like any record I had created, attached to cases I actually remembered performing, with charges that were not the charges I had actually generated. The first thing I felt was the specific cold of a surgeon reading documentation she didn't write. The professional wrongness of it. The same wrongness as reading an operative report with your name on it, describing a procedure you did not perform. Keeping my voice from doing what my body wanted it to do. These are my credentials, my cases. The dates are right. The patients are right. I looked up. The codes are wrong. These billing designations are for procedures at a complexity level I didn't perform. And these medication orders? I didn't order these. Watching me with the patient attention of someone who already knew what he was going to hear. We know. Very quietly. Who else knows? My office, you, and the person who built the record, because they built it to be found this way, with your name on it if the investigation reached this point. That was the first layer. It would not look the same once the second one appeared. I was 42 years old, and I had been at Meridian General for 15 years, which is long enough to know a place the way you know your own face. Not always consciously, but immediately, specifically, in the way that something out of place registers before you've named what it is. I had been recruited by Pruitt's predecessor, a quiet and precise woman named Dr. Helen Marsh, who had rebuilt the trauma department from inadequate to excellent, and who had retired, everyone said, for health reasons. I had liked her enormously, in the way you like someone you don't get enough time with. I had not thought about her retirement again until much later, until I had enough other pieces to understand what her retirement meant. Bernard Pruitt had been chief of surgery for 22 years when I arrived, and I had navigated him the way you navigate weather, with awareness, without drama, making adjustments as needed. He was precise in his benevolence. He remembered names and faces and the kinds of details that make people feel seen. He praised work in the specific terms that indicated he had actually reviewed it. And every formal advancement at Meridian General over 15 years had gone to someone who navigated the implicit politics of his operation with more ease than I did. Someone who understood, without being told, that certain disagreements belonged only in private and that public excellence was welcome, but public challenge was not. I had understood this. I had simply never found it possible to consistently comply with it, which is perhaps why, at 42, I was still a very good trauma surgeon and not a department head. I had made my peace with this, or I had told myself I had, which is something like peace until it isn't. My closest peer on staff was Dr. Reed Fallon, our chief anesthesiologist, 39, sandy-haired, with the easy authority of someone who is genuinely good at his job and knows it without being obnoxious about it. We had fallen into friendship the way you fall into friendships at hospitals. Shared meals, shared exhaustion, the shorthand of people who work in the same building for years and have learned each other's professional rhythms. He was a good listener. He asked thoughtful questions. He had been at Meridian for 4 years. My OR nurse, Diane Koch, had been on my surgical team for 6 years. 48, efficient, excellent at the preparation and execution of complex cases. She looked slightly past my left shoulder when she spoke to me, which I had always read as introversion, and which was something else entirely. Outside the hospital, and this is crucial, this is the only hour of my week when I could hear myself think, there was Tuesday evenings at the Riverside Community Arts Center, Stitch and Bitch Society, which is exactly what it sounds like. The 5 of us, needlework, hoops, wine, and a standing agreement that what gets said at Stitch and Bitch stays at Stitch and Bitch. Beverly Storch, 46, lives directly across Aldrich Street from me. Physical therapist, curly auburn hair, the kind of laugh that originates somewhere deep and anatomically genuine. She uses profanity the way other people use commas, not for emphasis so much as structure. She is one of the most loyal people I have ever known, and if you called her at 2 a.m., she would be at your door in 8 minutes with coffee and no questions about whether you deserved the loyalty. Lena Park, 38, drives 12 minutes from the north side, financial advisor, Korean-American, elegant in the manner of someone who has excellent instincts about nearly everything and has spent a career learning to trust them entirely. When she swears, it's rare and surgical and lands every time. Dolores Finch, D, 51, recently retired middle school teacher, reads everything. Still occasionally explains things to adults in the warm, patient tone of someone accustomed to a classroom. The strongest oath she has is, "For Pete's sake," delivered with complete conviction. Margot Sully, 44, yoga instructor, maintains earnest aspirations towards Zen equilibrium approximately 90% of the time. The other 10%, she swears in sustained creative strings that somehow reference chakra alignment and still manage to be worse than anything Bev produces. Tuesday evenings, the 5 of us around a long table with our hoops and our threads, the instructor circling occasionally, the warm, specific smell of the Arts Center, which is tea and warm wood and something faintly turpentine from the painting studio next door. I am working on a geometric design I started 4 months ago and will likely finish sometime after I retire. Bev is embroidering a botanically inaccurate flower she insists is impressionistic. Lena's work is precise and beautiful, and she finishes things in the time it takes me to thread a needle. Dee is making something for her granddaughter. Margot brings her own specialty tea, and her hoop has been displaying the same partially completed owl for 6 weeks, and the owl appears to be experiencing existential difficulty. I had mentioned the billing discrepancy at Stitch and Bitch 3 weeks before the rain. Casually, in the way you mention something that has been sitting in the back of your mind and that you have nearly convinced yourself is nothing. There was a weird flag on a Medicare summary, procedure code that doesn't match what I actually billed. I sent an email to the billing office. And no response. Lena set down her needle. How long ago? 11 days. Nora, you're going to pull the last 6 months of billing summaries, and you're going to do it before the end of the week. I think an 11-day silence from a billing office on a flagged discrepancy attached to a specific physician's credentials is not a clerical backlog. That's all I'm saying. Bev looked up from her inaccurate flower. How weird was the code? It was a billing designation for a more complex procedure than what I performed. The charge differential was significant. A silence, the kind with weight in it. Pull everything, said Lena. All of it, tonight if you can. I pressed my needle into the linen and looked at the geometric pattern I'd been building, stitch by careful stitch, for 4 months. The center had been clear from the beginning. The outer edges kept changing as I worked outward, each row revealing something about the shape that the previous row had only implied. I'm sure it's nothing. Pull the records, Nora. I pulled the records that weekend. What I found was what Lena had already understood it would be. Not one discrepancy, but a pattern. A consistent, calibrated pattern. The procedure codes inflated by a margin that was specific enough to be formulaic and small enough to stay below automated audit thresholds. Across 18 months, across multiple cases, under my name. This is the part where I want to tell you that I immediately understood what I was looking at. But that's not true. What I understood that first weekend at my kitchen table with the printout spread out in front of me was that someone had built something, not accidentally, not through a series of errors, but deliberately and with technical knowledge, and built it to look like mine. What I didn't understand yet was why. What I didn't understand yet was how far back it went, or how many people it touched, or what it was built on top of. That was still coming. Thomas Wren told me that first morning in the 4th floor corridor that the investigation had been active for 8 months. He told me that my credentials were the most recent layer of a scheme that spanned 3 years. He told me the total estimated amount was approximately $2.3 million, routed through a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands, and that 5 days remained before a federal audit team arrived to begin a formal review. As evenly as I could manage, looking at a number I was not entirely emotionally processing yet. What I'm looking at in these records, the billing inflation, how is it built? Technically. Measured. Careful. 2 access points. Pre-operative documentation, that's one entry point, upstream from billing, and anesthesia duration logging, that's a second entry point that feeds into the billing complexity calculation through a different channel. Both were modified after your own documentation was finalized. The modifications carry timestamps. The timestamps are what will matter. Pre-operative documentation. Anesthesia duration logging. Those were both things I was familiar with. Those were both things I touched in my workflow through specific people. I filed this piece without looking at it directly, the way you sometimes do when a piece is too large to look at immediately, when you need to hold it at the edge of your peripheral vision until you've assembled enough of the surrounding structure to understand what you're actually seeing. Carefully, the most important question. Who else inside this building knows the federal investigation is happening. Directly. No one. I need it to stay that way until Monday. Holding his gaze. I went to the billing office 11 days ago. No response. Something moving across his face that wasn't surprise. I know. He said it so quietly I almost missed the weight of it. Not, I'll look into that. Not, that's consistent with what we've found. He said, I know, the way you say it when the fact you're confirming is one of the uglier pieces in the assembly. The 11-day silence hadn't been a backlog. The second layer began forming. I had 4 surgical cases that day. I operated. I am good enough at this that I can be fully present in an operating room while carrying a significant weight in the adjacent room of my mind. Not splitting focus, but compartmentalizing with the specific discipline that medical training either develops in you or breaks you with. The body on the table received everything it needed. Between cases, in the brief minutes of transition, I was assembling. Preoperative documentation, Diane Koch, 6 years, my team, every complex case, upstream from billing. Anesthesia duration logging, Reed Fallon, or any of the anesthesia team, but principally Reed, as chief, on my complex cases. A different channel into the same calculation. 2 access points, 2 people, 1 formula, 1 name. The geometry of it was clean, which meant it had been designed. By 3 p.m., I was in my car in the parking structure, and I was not thinking about the geometry. I was sitting with my hands flat on my thighs, looking at the concrete pillar in front of me, doing the controlled breathing I use when what I want to do is not available to me. What I wanted to do was go directly to Pruitt's office and lay the billing records on his desk and watch his face. What I was not going to do was that, because Thomas Wren had said, be very careful about who you speak to inside this building, with a specificity that was not cautionary boilerplate, and I was going to sit with that specificity until I understood it. I called Bev. Immediately, before I had said anything, what happened? Controlling my voice very precisely, is everyone available tonight? My place. I need the group. A pause. Quietly, shifting completely into the register she uses when something is real. 7 o'clock. I'll text the others. Bring everything you have. At 7 o'clock, I sat at my own kitchen table with the billing records and the folder Thomas had shown me, and 4 women who had known me long enough not to need the preamble. I laid it out in order. The rain, Thomas Wren, the federal ID, the 5 days, the pattern in the codes, the 2 access points, the name on the record. When I finished, Lena had already pulled the billing summaries toward herself and was arranging them in an order that made analytical sense, which was not the order I'd given them. The margin is consistent, 14%, sustained across 18 months. This isn't someone who stumbled into a billing error. This is someone who ran this the way you run a financial model. You test the margin, you set it below the flag threshold, you maintain it. This took months to establish, and it's been running on autopilot since. It's also very easy to attribute to the physician of record rather than to whoever built it, because the physician's name is on everything. The manipulation is in the metadata. Dee looked at me over her reading glasses. Nora, who at your hospital has both the technical knowledge to build this and the sustained access to do it over 18 months? I looked at the table. The needle I'd taken from my embroidery bag was in my fingers. I do this sometimes, handle something small and tactile when I need to think. I turned it between my fingers, end to end. Pre-op documentation runs through my OR nurse. Anesthesia duration logging is anesthesia's domain, which means either one of them, or both of them, or someone who directed both of them. The needle went still in my fingers. Directed. Bev leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. We're talking about the chief. He doesn't have direct access to either documentation stream. He'd need intermediaries who do. Which would explain why your name is on the record rather than his, said Lena. If both access points are attributed to their respective operators, your nurse, your anesthesiologist, and both operators are filing under your credentials, then the scheme is invisible at the top. The paper trail terminates with you. The kitchen was quiet. Somewhere outside, the October rain that had been threatening all evening finally arrived, tapping the window glass with the patient certainty of something that had been planning this. Margot set down her tea. After a moment, genuinely trying to be constructive, "Can I do the completely unhinged brainstorm, just to clear the air?" Without particular enthusiasm, but not refusing. "Go ahead," with the gravity of someone who has thought about this. "Okay, you get the biggest bullhorn you can find. You stand on the roof of the hospital. You read every single billing discrepancy into it at 6 a.m. before the morning shift starts." She paused. "And you do it in the goat costume from the pediatric wing." Very slowly, with dignity. "The what?" said Dee, looking around. "There's a therapy goat situation on the pediatric floor. Gerald. He is highly mobile and frequently unsupervised. I'm just saying he's a resource." "We are not using the goat," I said. "Noted and retired," said Margot, looking at the records, bringing us back. "Nora," said Lena, "you need 2 things before Monday morning. First, your own copies of the original, unaltered records from a source that isn't under hospital administration's control. Second, you need to understand who else inside that building has access to the full picture. And you need to assume that anyone with institutional loyalty to Pruitt is a risk." "Right," looking at me directly. "And Nora, tell me who you are going to go to inside the hospital. Your first instinct." I thought about it. Franklin Whitmore, board member. I've always read him as someone with... Don't. The word landed clean, with no decoration. "Okay. Not yet. Not until you know the full shape." I did not know the full shape yet. I was still holding individual pieces, each one legible, each one coherent on its own terms. The shape would come later. The shape would cost something. The next morning, I watched Diane Koch move through the pre-operative documentation for my 7 a.m. case. I was not watching the way I am usually not watching. I was watching the way you watch when you already know something is there and you are looking for the specific evidence of the specific thing you know. Diane worked with her usual efficiency. At one point, believing I was reviewing the patient chart, she paused at the keyboard for 4 seconds, a pause with no procedural explanation, before completing an entry. 4 seconds. I know how long 4 seconds is. I counted it. I made a note of the timestamp. I scrubbed in. After the procedure, coming out of the scrub room, I found Reed Fallon in the corridor. He was walking toward me with the particular energy of someone who has heard something and come to offer support. "I heard Pruitt called a billing review on some of your records. Everything okay?" I looked at him. His face was exactly as it always was. Open, warm, the easy concern of a friend. "Just some discrepancies they're looking at, probably a coding issue." "What kind of discrepancies? Is there anything I can do to help? I could pull the anesthesia logs from those cases, cross-reference. It might clarify the timing questions."
I let one beat pass. Why would the anesthesia logs clarify billing code discrepancies? His face didn't move.
But something behind it did. A recalibration so fast it was almost invisible. The specific micro-adjustment of someone who has just offered more than they intended to offer and is computing how much it revealed. Just thinking, if the complexity coding is in question, the procedure duration and anesthesia record might establish the actual complexity level. That's all I meant. Thanks, Reed. I'll let you know. I watched him walk away. I pulled the anesthesia duration logs for the first 3 cases on the billing discrepancy list as soon as I could access a terminal. Reed Fallon's initials were on all 3, which in itself proved nothing. He was chief anesthesiologist. His initials appeared on much of the OR documentation. But in the specific field where procedure duration was logged, the field that fed into the billing complexity calculation, the times were different from my own surgical documentation. Inflated by 14%. Exactly 14%. The same margin Lena had identified in the billing codes. I sat in the break room with the logs on the screen in front of me, and I put together what I had. Diane upstream in pre-op documentation, Reed downstream in anesthesia duration. 2 channels, 1 formula, 1 name. The formula had been running for 18 months under my credentials, and both operators had sustained access to exactly the documentation streams required, and one of them had just offered, unprompted, to help me cross-reference the specific records that would have shown me the manipulation, if I hadn't already seen it, if the offer hadn't told me everything it needed to tell me just by existing. The geometry of it was very clean. Someone had built a clean machine. I went to the bathroom. I ran cold water over my wrists until my hands were steady. Then I went back to work. That was the 3rd layer, and it was nothing compared to what came next. On Thursday morning, I found the Eleanor Webb file. I want to be exact about this. I was not looking for it. I was in the medical records archive on the 2nd floor, pulling my own historical documentation as part of the private reconstruction I'd been conducting since Monday, when the folder 2 positions ahead of mine in the filing sequence caught my eye because it had a flag sticker on it. The pale blue administrative flag that indicates a file has been reclassified. Not once. 3 pale blue stickers stacked. 3 reclassifications on a single patient file. I pulled it out of the sequence. I read it standing at the archive shelf. Eleanor Webb, 53, presented to Meridian General Hospital's emergency department 12 years ago in the early hours of a February morning with acute cardiac symptoms. The initial triage assessment recommended emergency catheterization. The catheterization was not performed. The file documented the reason as patient condition stabilized, intervention deferred. Eleanor Webb died in the waiting room 3 hours after her initial presentation. The first pale blue reclassification sticker was dated 2 weeks after her death. It reclassified the reason for the deferred intervention. The new reason, patient declined recommended procedure. The second sticker, dated 8 months later, reclassified the triage assessment. The revised documentation indicated a lower urgency level than the original triage had recorded. The third sticker, dated 3 years later, reclassified the case category. I stood at the archive shelf and read this 3 times. The fluorescent light above the archive was the clinical, flat white of institutional lighting everywhere, without shadow, without warmth, without the quality of illuminating anything in particular. The file was very thin, thinner than an acute cardiac case that terminated in death should be. Some of the pages were new. Some of the pages were not. I photographed every page on my phone with the timestamp feature active. Then I put the file back in the sequence. I walked to the elevator. I pressed the button for my floor. I stood in the elevator with my hands in my pockets and looked at the number changing, and felt something that I am still not sure I have a precise word for. Not anger, though anger was present, and not grief, though that was present too. Something more specific. The sensation of understanding that a thing you have been inside for 15 years is not the thing you believed it to be, that it has an architecture you were never shown, and that the architecture has been operational the entire time you were there, and that the thing that architecture was designed to do had already been done 12 years ago to a woman named Eleanor Webb, who died in a waiting room because someone had made a calculation about the cost of her emergency care. 3 reclassifications, 3 careful adjustments to make a decision look like a different decision. Someone had gone back into that file not once, but 3 times, refining the story until it said what they needed it to say. This is the moment the mosaic became a mosaic. Not a billing irregularity, not a fraud scheme. The billing irregularity was built on top of something older, something that had required ongoing maintenance for 12 years. I called Lena from the parking structure. I told her what I'd found. "Pull everything you can on that patient's family," she said, very quietly. "And Nora, call me back when you're home, not from the hospital." I know. I mean it. Not from anywhere in that building. That evening at my kitchen table, I searched for Eleanor Webb's family. It didn't take long. Her son, Marcus Webb, was easily findable. He had a professional profile, a federal attorney based in the city, specializing in healthcare fraud and patient rights. I read his profile for a long time. A federal attorney specializing in healthcare fraud, whose mother had died at Meridian General 12 years ago after an emergency intervention was denied and subsequently documented as declined, who had filed, I found this in a county records database, formal complaints with Meridian General's internal review board in the months following his mother's death. 3 complaints across the first 2 years after Eleanor died. 3 complaints, 3 reclassifications. The timing was exact. I stared at my screen. The parallel lines were becoming visible. The investigation that had been running alongside everything I thought I understood about this hospital, invisible to me, moving through the same institution from a completely different angle. Someone had been pulling at the threads of Eleanor Webb's death for 12 years. Someone had been rebuilding the documentation around those threads for just as long. The scheme I was standing in the middle of was not a scheme for money alone. The money was architecture. The money funded the ongoing maintenance of a cover-up that had to keep working, that had to keep paying the right people to keep quiet, that had to generate enough institutional stability to prevent anyone from looking too closely at the file with 3 reclassification stickers in the second-floor archive. This was not the second layer. This was not the third layer. I no longer knew how many layers there were. I picked up my phone and called Thomas Wren. He met me at Meridian Roasters, 6 blocks from the hospital, at 9 p.m. A booth at the back, high wooden sides, the specific acoustic privacy of a space that has been designed for conversations that shouldn't carry. He was already seated, black coffee. He looked at me across the table with the patient attention of someone who had been waiting for me to get to this point. I put my phone on the table between us with the photographs of the Eleanor Webb file on the screen. He looked at them. He didn't touch the phone. He didn't say anything for a moment. "Where did you find these?" Second floor archive. The file was still in the physical record sequence. 3 reclassification stickers. Our investigation began as a Medicare billing complaint. Anonymous tip, 8 months ago. It became something larger when we started pulling the documentation history and found that the billing irregularities were consistent with a pattern of care denials. Procedures billed as performed at one level, documented as declined by the patient, with the documentation altered after the fact. The billing fraud was generating funds. The funds were being used to maintain the documentation alterations and to retain the cooperation of everyone who needed to cooperate. The documentation alterations go back 12 years. Eleanor Webb's death was not the first. It was the one that was reported, repeatedly, by her son. It was the one where the reporting created a documentation problem that required the most active maintenance. How many people have maintained that documentation? He looked at me directly, and I understood from the way he looked at me that this was the answer to the question that changed everything. We have identified 7 individuals with access to the patient records that have been altered. That number includes current hospital staff. It includes a board member, and it includes a physician who has been at this hospital for 4 years and who was present at Meridian General the night Eleanor Webb died as a first-year resident. The coffee shop was warm and quiet, and the rain that had moved in again tonight was steady against the front window, and I sat very still and I looked at Thomas Wren's pale blue eyes, and I did not let myself say Reed Fallon's name. I didn't need to. Thomas's expression did not change. A moment, my voice coming out steadier than I expected. He saw her turned away, and he said nothing. He received his chief anesthesiologist appointment 4 years ago, 2 weeks after he joined the staff. The appointment was Pruitt's. He's been in the documentation chain since then. The reward. The 4-year gap between the night at the hospital as a resident and the current position. The gap during which, presumably, he'd kept quiet, moved to other institutions, waited. The appointment 2 weeks after his arrival. Immediate, generous, unprompted. A reward for a silence that had been costing him something for 12 years. I thought about 4 years of lunch conversations, the thoughtful questions, the easy warmth, the particular intimacy of colleagues who spend years in the same building and have learned each other's professional rhythms and who, I now understood, have very different relationships to the truth of the institution they're standing in. To myself, not performing this, he knew the whole time. Yes. Looking at the coffee in front of me that I hadn't touched. Tell me about the board member. He told me about Franklin Whitmore. Whitmore, 68, 11 years on the board of Meridian General. Brother-in-law to Bernard Pruitt by marriage 23 years ago. Member of the hospital's Internal Review Committee, the committee that had received and processed and concluded Marcus Webb's 3 formal complaints about his mother's death. The committee chairman, in fact, for the last 8 years. Each of Marcus's complaints had been reviewed. Each had been concluded with a finding of no procedural violation. Each review had been chaired by Franklin Whitmore. With precision, not performing emotion because the emotion was somewhere else, somewhere beneath functioning. He buried the complaints 3 times, and his name appears on the financial documentation for the shell company that receives the Medicare surplus payments. He is not a passive participant. I sat with this for a moment. The piece I had nearly gone to for help. The person I had been planning to approach on Thursday, which was tomorrow. The board member with his professional warmth and his 11 years of institutional trust, who had been running interference for this machine for the entirety of his tenure, who had sat in a formal review capacity over the death of a woman he had decided didn't constitute a procedural violation worth investigating. I had nearly walked into his office and handed him everything I had. Very quietly, to myself, "That's why you said be careful about who you speak to." Nodding once, measuring the word carefully. Yes. Pressing my palms flat on the table, feeling the cool of the wood. "What do you need from me?" "Your documentation, your testimony, your agreement to let this proceed through the proper channels and not through anything that might compromise evidentiary standing." He paused. "And your patience. 3 more days." Without hesitation, because the alternative was everything this machine had been doing for 12 years. Done. I did not go to Franklin Whitmore. I did, however, go to Franklin Whitmore. This is the part where I made the mistake that could have collapsed everything, and the reason I made it was something I am not proud of. I believed I could control the information I was giving him. I believed I could hand him a limited piece, enough to read his reaction, not enough to damage anything, and use that reaction as data. This was a surgeon's instinct applied outside its correct domain. In surgery, controlled exposure is a valid diagnostic technique. In a room with a man who has been running interference for a corrupt machine for 11 years, it is simply not. I had spent Thursday morning pulling additional records, not through the hospital system, I was careful about that, but through the public county health database, where certain aggregate reporting lived. What I found there was the piece I hadn't expected. The Joint Commission Accreditation Review 2 years ago. Meridian General had passed with distinction. The reviewing physician was named in the summary as Dr. William Adler, Emeritus Professor, Retired Chief of Medicine. The acknowledgments section of the internal report thanked, among others, Franklin Whitmore for his coordination of the review process. A board member had coordinated the external accreditation review that cleared the hospital of any quality of care concerns. The same board member who had run the internal reviews that cleared the hospital of Marcus Webb's complaints. The same board member who sat on the financial documentation of the shell company. This was not a board member. This was a function, a human infrastructure component designed to make the machine look, from every external angle, like a hospital. I did not take this to Whitmore. I took it home. I sat with it at my kitchen table while the October night pressed against the window glass and went through what I had, piece by piece, building the complete shape of what I was standing in the middle of. 7 people, 12 years, 1 woman in a waiting room, and on top of that, 18 months of Medicare fraud, $2.3 million, and a paper trail terminating in my name. The shape, when complete, was very large. I picked up my needle and worked on the geometric embroidery for 2 hours. Stitch by stitch, the pattern building outward from a center that had been clear from the beginning. At some point, Bev texted, "Checking in." I texted back, "Still working." She sent back, "I know. We're here." I put the needle down at midnight and looked at the compass on the mantelpiece. To it, to my mother, to the version of me that had started this job 15 years ago with a theory that good medicine would be sufficient. She didn't get to come home. Eleanor Webb, 53, acute cardiac presentation, intervention deferred, patient declined, recommended procedure. Standing up, going to the mantelpiece, picking up the compass, and holding it in both hands the way my mother had placed it in mine in a parking lot in May light when I was a different age with a different understanding of what I was getting into. Okay, I did go to Whitmore on Thursday, and I did make the mistake I said I was going to make, and I have to be honest about that because it matters. I had rationalized it. I would give him a limited piece. I would watch his face. I would gain information without losing any of my position. I was wrong on every count. What I gave him was the billing discrepancy and my concern about the pattern. What I did not give him was Thomas, or the archive, or Eleanor Webb, or Marcus Webb. He listened with folded hands and a grave, sympathetic expression. Gravely, completely convincingly. Nora, you were absolutely right to bring this to me. I'll look into this personally and immediately. This kind of thing needs to be addressed at the board level. He called Pruitt in the time it took me to walk back to the trauma unit. I know this because 40 minutes after I left Whitmore's office, a suspension notice was in my email, signed by Patricia Grubb, copied to Pruitt. Administrative irregularities under investigation. Surrender your hospital ID. Do not access hospital records or systems. Effective immediately. I read it standing at a terminal in the trauma unit, the unit where I had worked for 15 years. The linoleum wheel on the orderly's cart was still squeaking. It had been squeaking for 3 weeks. I had meant to report it to facilities. I picked up my coat. The parking structure in the middle of a Thursday afternoon is not the loneliest place I have ever been. But it was the loneliest place I had been in some time. I sat in the car and did the breathing exercise I use when what I need is not available to me. And then I did a second one, and then a third. And then I called Bev. Where are you? Parking structure. Come here. Now. On my way. Bev's house is directly across Aldrich Street from mine, which is to say it is 30 yards from my front door, which is to say it took me 7 minutes from the parking structure. She was on the porch before I was fully out of the car, and she met me at the steps with the expression of someone who has already made a decision about how this afternoon is going to go. Inside. Sit. Tell me. I told her. The suspension, the timing, Whitmore's call, the machine that had been running while I stood in it and treated patients and believed, in the way you believe things you've never examined because they've always been there, that I was working inside an institution with a genuine orientation toward care. Bev listened to all of it. She made coffee. She brought it to the table and sat down across from me with her hands wrapped around her own mug and her face very still in the way it gets when she is holding something too large for her usual register. The woman who died, Eleanor, 12 years ago, February. Did she have family? A son. He filed 3 complaints with the Internal Review Board. All 3 were closed by Whitmore. A pause. Bev looked at her coffee. So when you went to the board, you went to the person who, yes. It's okay, she breathed. Okay. What does Monday actually look like? Tell me exactly. I told her. She listened. She asked 3 specific questions. Then she stood up and went to her phone and said she was texting the group, and by 6 o'clock, Lena and Dee and Margot were at Bev's kitchen table with their embroidery bags and their coats still half on, and the expression of people who have come somewhere because they are needed. I laid out everything, the complete shape, piece by piece. The billing fraud and the documentation alterations and the Eleanor Webb file and the 3 complaints and Whitmore and the Joint Commission and Reed and Diane and the Shell Company. I laid it out in order, each piece in sequence, and I watched the four of them as the shape assembled in front of them the way it had assembled in front of me. Each piece looking explicable alone, the horror accumulating as the pieces found each other, and something worse than any individual piece emerged from the whole. When I finished, the table was quiet. After a long moment, with controlled precision, 7 people, said Lena, that I know of. And the woman who died, her son has been complaining for 12 years. Federal attorney now. He's been cooperating with the investigation from the beginning. Thomas told me it was Marcus's original complaint that opened the federal case. Dee looked at me over her reading glasses with the expression of a woman who spent 26 years in front of classrooms and has seen, in that time, the full range of what human beings are capable of in their worst and best moments. He's been doing this for 12 years. He has. Not as an accusation, just as a fact that needed to be said. She deserved better. She did. Margot had her embroidery hoop in her hands, but wasn't working. She was holding it the way you hold something you need to hold on to. What needs to happen before Monday morning? I need my original documentation from my personal records, which I maintain independently. I need the Eleanor Webb photographs. I need the anesthesia duration cross-reference I already have. And I need Thomas to know I have it, so it goes into the federal file before Monday. And the 5 of us know everything you just told us. Bev, you can't. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm observing that there are now 6 people who know the full shape. That's not a liability. That's insurance. She met my eyes. Nobody gets to pretend none of this happened. I looked at her. I looked at all of them. Okay. Lena poured wine. Dee began reviewing the billing records with the patient thoroughness of someone who has corrected a lot of wrong things in her career and knows that accuracy in the record is the foundation of everything that follows. Margot resumed her embroidery, the unfinished owl in its existential difficulty, and there was something comforting about that, the normalcy of the needle and the hoop in the middle of all of this. Bev refilled her coffee and sat back and said, with the considered seriousness of someone presenting a real proposal, I want to be on record. I think you should hand-deliver the Eleanor Webb file to every member of the Joint Commission Accreditation Board individually, by courier, with a cover letter written by Marcus Webb before Monday morning. We are not doing that, said Lena. I know, but I want it in the record that I suggested it. Noted, said Dee, without looking up from her hoop mildly. It does have a certain energy, said Margot. I almost smiled, the first time in 3 days. Saturday morning, I returned to the hospital with my East Side stairwell key, which had been issued 7 years ago for a specific logistical reason and never reclaimed, and which let me enter without going through the main entrance. I was not accessing record systems. I was going to my office to retrieve a personal item, the compass, which I had moved there 2 weeks ago and which I needed back. If on the way to my office, I happened to walk through the second-floor archive and observed through the open door of the billing records room, propped open by someone who had left materials stacked there on their way out for the weekend, additional physical documentation relevant to what the federal investigators were already assembling, then I was simply a woman walking past an open room, noting what she observed, photographing it for her own reference. I was in the billing records room for 8 minutes. I found several things. The quarterly financial reports for the shell company, filed under a corporate name that required 2 levels of interpretation to connect to Meridian General's receivables. 3 resignation letters from former physicians, redacted, but with enough formatting preserved to confirm they were formal administrative pressure departures rather than voluntary ones. And a document that took me a moment to identify. The minutes of a board meeting 6 years ago in which Franklin Whitmore had moved to amend the hospital's internal documentation retention policy in a way that would, in practice, make certain historical records significantly harder to access through standard requests. The motion had passed 4-3. I photographed everything with the timestamp feature active. Then the supply room door adjacent to the billing room swung open, and Gerald, the therapy goat from the pediatric floor, came through it. He was wearing his pale blue therapy animal pediatrics vest. He had apparently navigated 2 staircases and a fire door to arrive at the second-floor billing records room, and he entered with the composed, unhurried authority of a creature who has always been heading here. I stared at him. He regarded the room with yellow-eyed interest. Quietly to the goat, "Gerald, how?" Gerald offered no explanation. He walked to the shelf of quarterly financial reports. He sniffed the nearest folder. He bit the corner of it, not aggressively, assessingly. Under my breath, urgent. No, those are Gerald. The goat blinked. He maintained a reflective hold on the folder corner. I took my photographs. I retrieved my compass from my office. I exited via the east stairwell and drove home and texted Bev. Gerald was in the billing records room eating the quarterly financial reports. I believe he has been briefed. Her response came in 22 seconds. He has always known. Gerald has been conducting his own investigation. I drove home. I held the compass in one hand on the wheel. The needle inside it was steady. Sunday was the night before, the night that existed between everything I had assembled and the room where it would be presented. I have had nights like this before surgery, the hours before a complex case, when everything that can be prepared has been prepared, and what remains is the waiting and the body's quiet assessment of its own readiness. The night before my boards, the night before my first solo thoracic repair, the night before I had a conversation with a patient's family that would change the rest of their lives. This was that kind of night. I worked at the kitchen table until 1 a.m., organized, labeled, cross-referenced, put together the materials in the order Thomas and I had discussed in 2 phone calls across the weekend. The procedural order, the evidentiary order, the order that made the largest and clearest shape from the most pieces in the least time. I am efficient at this. Trauma surgery is ultimately about making the most of the information you have in the time you have it. At 1 a.m., I made tea and sat with the compass in my hands for a while. My mother had been a surgeon in a hospital not unlike Meridian General. She had navigated administrators and politics and the slow accumulation of institutional compromise that accretes around any institution that is also a business. She had done it for 32 years, and she had been good, and she had been honest, and she had protected her patients with the ferocity of someone who understood that the body on the table was the only thing in the room that was not capable of protecting itself. She had given me the compass in a parking lot in May light. She had said, "The compass doesn't care about the chaos. It just points." I don't know what she would have said about this particular Monday morning. I think she would have been frightened for me and proud of me and furious at the institution. And I think she would have made tea and sat with it and then said something practically useful about getting some sleep. I went to sleep at 2. I woke at 6. I ate breakfast at the kitchen table in the morning quiet. Toast, coffee, the specific ordinariness of a morning that is about to be unusual. I put the compass in my jacket pocket. I gathered my materials. I drove to Meridian General Hospital for what I did not know would be the last time as a trauma surgeon rather than the chief of the trauma department, though it turned out to be both. Conference Room B, 7 federal auditors in coordinated Navy blazers. The lead auditor, a compact, careful woman named Sandra Yee, with the expression of someone who has reviewed a great deal of difficult paperwork and is no longer surprised by what it contains. 2 other OIG staff I hadn't met, David Marsh, the hospital's attorney, with a full legal pad and an expression I now recognized as the expression of a man who has been reviewing what he has signed and finding some of it troubling. Patricia Grubb, with her empty legal pad and her professional warmth pointed at the middle distance. Bernard Pruitt at the head of the table. Thomas Wren at the far end with his manila folder and his pale blue eyes and the 4 sutures along his jaw. And, in a chair by the wall, set slightly apart, a man in his early 40s with his hands in his lap and a stillness that I recognized as something you arrive at on the far side of a very long wait. He had his mother's build. I didn't know that then. I only know it now from a photograph I have seen since. He looked at Bernard Pruitt when he came in, and Pruitt looked at him, and in that exchange of looks was 12 years of accumulated consequence waiting to be discharged. Marcus Webb. I walked in and took the seat Thomas indicated, across from the auditors, and the meeting began. Pruitt's attorney made the first procedural move, a technical challenge to the document subpoena scope. Thomas produced the paragraph from the FCA subpoena that addressed it directly. Marsh read the paragraph and stopped moving his pen. Pruitt stepped in, expansive, warm, the practiced authority of 22 years at the head of tables. With compassionate gravity, addressing the lead auditor directly. I want to be fully transparent with your team. We have identified what we believe to be a billing irregularity in the records of one of our physicians. Dr. Calloway is currently under administrative suspension pending our internal review of these matters. I want to assure you of our full cooperation in helping your team understand the source of these discrepancies. He looked at me. The brief, measured look of a man who has played this specific move before. I opened my folder. I have here my original surgical documentation for every case on the billing discrepancy report, from my personal case records maintained independently of hospital systems, and from the EMR archive timestamps showing that the billing codes were modified after my own documentation was finalized. The modifications were made through 2 access points: pre-operative documentation, accessed through my OR nurse's credentials, and anesthesia duration logging, accessed through anesthesia department credentials. The inflation is consistent, 14%, applied across 18 months. I placed the documents on the table in order. I have an email I sent to the billing office 11 days ago flagging a discrepancy I noticed, time-stamped and unresponded to. I let that sit for one beat. I also have the patient file of Eleanor Webb. The room changed. It was not loud. It was the opposite of loud. It was the specific quality of silence that settles into a room when something has been said that cannot be unsaid, and everyone present understands this simultaneously. I had photographed the file in its entirety, with timestamps, and had the printout in my folder. I placed it on the table, page by page. Eleanor Webb presented to this emergency department 12 years ago in acute cardiac distress. She was assessed as requiring emergency intervention. The intervention was not performed. She died in the waiting room. The documentation in her file has been reclassified 3 times since her death, each reclassification occurring within weeks of a formal complaint filed by her son. I placed the photographs of the 3 reclassification stickers. Mr. Marcus Webb is present in this room. Everyone looked at Marcus Webb. He was very still. The reclassifications were made by individuals with administrative access to the patient records system. The billing fraud, currently under federal investigation, generates funds that have been used to maintain the documentation alterations and to retain the cooperation of individuals who have sustained knowledge of the original incident. I have documentation showing that Franklin Whitmore, current board member and Internal Review Committee chairman, sat as review chair over all 3 of Marcus Webb's formal complaints, and that his name appears in the financial documentation for the shell company receiving the Medicare surplus payments. A silence. Then Marsh set down his pen. Then Patricia Grubb, without looking at Pruitt, said, with the controlled effort of someone setting down something very heavy, I want to speak to my attorney, separately, not through hospital counsel. Pruitt looked at her. Separately from Dr. Pruitt. I want to make that clear. Thomas opened the door at the far end of the room. The 2 individuals from the U.S. Marshal's office who had been waiting in the corridor came in. Thomas placed his complete 8-month investigation file on the table, 3 inches thick, flagged throughout with the patient accumulation of someone who has been building toward a specific room for a very long time. And then Marcus Webb, who had been sitting by the wall in silence for all of this, spoke for the first time. He didn't stand. He didn't raise his voice. He looked at Bernard Pruitt with the eyes of someone who has been carrying something for 12 years, and he said, in a voice that was entirely steady, her name was Eleanor. She was 53. She liked gardening and bad television, and she made the best pie in the county. And she died in your waiting room because you calculated that her Medicaid coverage didn't justify the emergency cost. He paused. I've been trying to say that in this building for 12 years. I wanted you to know I finally got to. Pruitt said nothing. He had, I thought, the expression of a man who has heard the sentence that closes the door on a chapter, and who knows that the chapter is closed, and who is simply sitting in the remaining space of it, waiting for what comes next to arrive. What came next was the marshal's paperwork. 35 minutes later, while the attorneys were sorting through the formal documentation and Sandra Yee's team was beginning their systematic review of Thomas's assembled file, I walked down the 5th floor corridor toward the elevator. I had no particular destination. I was moving because standing still felt like the wrong choice, and I hadn't yet identified the right one. The billing records room door was open. I looked in as I passed. Bernard Pruitt's office, adjacent to the billing room through a connecting door that had been left open in the morning's movement of people, contained Gerald the therapy goat, seated in the leather chair behind the desk with the settled composure of a creature who has found his correct location and sees no reason to move. On the desk in front of him was what appeared to have been the quarterly budget proposal, which he was working through with methodical calm. 3 pediatric floor staff were in the office doorway, one of them with a phone. Gerald looked at me. He blinked his long-lashed yellow eyes. To the therapy coordinator with complete seriousness. What is he eating? With great weariness. The Q4 budget proposal. I looked at Gerald in the leather chair for a moment. Then I looked at the desk. Then at Gerald again, because he had earned it. Good boy. The nurse took the photograph. It would become, I was told over the following days, the most liked post in the hospital's social media history. The caption, written by the charge nurse, "New management reviewing old priorities. Gerald is already making cuts. I walked to the elevator. I pressed the button for my floor. I stood in it and looked at the numbers changing. And when the doors opened, I stepped out into the corridor that had been mine for 15 years and kept walking. 3 months. January. The Riverside Community Arts Center is warm in January. Tuesday evenings, the 5 of us around the long table with our hoops, the instructor passing occasionally, the specific smell of the Arts Center, warm wood and tea, and the faint turpentine note from the painting studio next door. Outside the windows, January is committed and indifferent, doing what January does. I am working on a new piece. I finished the geometric design in November. It had taken 4 months and 6 sessions and looked, at the end, exactly like it had always been going to look. The center clear from the beginning, the outer edges building outward in the way patterns do when you stay with them long enough and let each row inform the next. I gave it to Beverly. She hung it across the street in her living room where I can see it from my window, which is either a tribute or a hostage situation, and I have decided to read it as both. The new piece is different, not a pattern, an object, a compass rose in 4 colors, each point a slightly different length, the cardinal directions marked in the old way, with letters that take longer to stitch than numbers, but that look, when finished, like something that has always been true, rather than something recently decided. Lena's current piece has the alignment of a professional draftsperson. How is the new role? Not looking up either. Still getting used to it. The new chief is doing well, from an outside observer's perspective. Scry, I am, I said. I said I'm getting used to it. That's different. With a teacher's gentle patience. What are you getting used to, specifically? I thought about it. Outside, January was doing its thing. The thread in my needle was a deep navy blue, the color of the North Point on any compass, the color of Thomas Wren's suit the morning I walked into Conference Room B. The fact that it's still the same building, the same corridors, the same lights, the same linoleum on the trauma floor that squeaks in the same place. I pulled the thread through. It's different now, but it looks the same from outside. Without her hoop, just holding her thread. Is that good or bad? It's complicated. I spent 15 years learning that building, and now I understand it differently, and that understanding is permanent. And the building is still there, and I'm still in it, and there are good people in it who've been good the whole time. And I'm the chief now, and the cases still come in, and the body on the table still needs what it needs. I set down my needle. I just know more about the building now. Bev looked at me across the table with the expression of someone who knows that the thing she's about to say is true and is deciding whether to say it. She'd have liked knowing you did this. She didn't specify who. She didn't need to. A moment, looking at the compass rose on my hoop. Yeah. Pruitt had been arrested and arraigned, his bail set at an amount that did not preclude release, but that made very clear the court's assessment of his flight risk calculation. Patricia Grubb had agreed to full cooperation with the federal investigation in exchange for an arrangement that did not preserve her professional license or her administrative position. Reed Fallon had been charged separately. His testimony, fully offered and thoroughly corroborated, had done relatively little to improve his position, because the documented nature of his participation over 4 years was not improved upon by the admission of it. Diane Koch had resigned and was cooperating. Franklin Whitmore had stepped down from the board, quietly, before anyone formally requested it, and was under separate federal investigation. The shell company had been frozen. The Medicare restitution claim had been formally filed. 7 individuals were at various points in a legal process that would take years and resolve in the way that these things resolve, with specific accountability for specific people, and the slower institutional accountability of a hospital that would spend considerable time and resources establishing that it was, now, different. Marcus Webb attended Pruitt's arraignment. I had not met him before that morning, and I had stood on the courthouse steps in the November cold and watched him walk out with his hands in his pockets and the specific stillness of someone who has completed something that has occupied a very large part of his life. He stopped beside me for a moment, looking at the street quietly. She used to say that the good ones keep going regardless. Keep practicing medicine regardless. Looking at the street alongside him. She sounds like she was right. With something that was not quite a smile, but was in that direction. She was right about most things. A pause. Thank you for finding the file. It should have stayed findable. He nodded. He walked to his car. I went home. Now in January, at the long table with my compass rose, each stitch deliberate, each point of the design building toward a center that I can see clearly, even though I'm still working outward from it. I thought about what my mother had put in my hands in a parking lot in May light. The compass she'd carried for 32 years, the weight of it familiar and warm. I had put it on the mantelpiece and walked past it so many times that it had receded into ordinary. I had looked at it the night before the conference room and felt it return from ordinary, felt it as what it had always been, not decor, not sentiment, but an instruction. To myself, to the room, to no one. The compass doesn't care about the chaos. Looking up, hearing, immediately warm. Sorry? Nothing, thinking. Looking at my hoop with the expert appraisal of a woman whose embroidery is always better than everyone else's. The north point is slightly longer than the others. Is that intentional? Pulling the next stitch. Yes. Accepting this immediately. Good. It should be. Outside the window, January continued. Inside, the 5 of us worked with needles and thread, building things with precision and patience and the satisfaction of hands that know what they're doing. The compass rose on my hoop grew outward from its center, point by careful point, each one finding its right length, its right direction. The north point was longest. It should be. It always should be.